Imagine a single empire where a road, a coin, and a navy could change millions of lives. The Pax Romana offered something like peace, and that peace bred not just ability, but an appetite for exchange. In these opening moments, I want you to feel how commerce became the artery of Rome, pulsing from city to farm. From port to palace, this story is not just about maps and markets, it is about how infrastructure created trust between strangers. The Roman state learned to convert violence into rules and roads, and trade followed those rules, like a shadow follows a man. Long before trade could flourish, Rome built a network of roads that felt like an organism. These roads did not appear by accident. They were deliberate civic projects designed to move legions, information, and crucially, goods across unimaginable distances. Each paved mile reduced friction and turned distant markets into reachable promises of profit. The roads demanded engineering skill, discipline, and a political will to maintain them over generations. In return, they gave merchants predictable travel times, lowered transportation costs, and a physical sense of unity that money and law alone could not produce. Romans measured their realm with milestones and surveyors who carved distances into stone and memory. Each milestone was an imperial claim and a promise of continuity, marking the empire with a network of measured trust between cities. The maintenance of these roads involved local communities, state treasuries, and military logistics working together for common benefit. Roads became economic instruments that transformed the cost of moving grain, pottery, and people across provinces. Where travel once took months, well-maintained roads brought merchants into the same market day, which changed pricing, storage needs, and the very psychology of commerce. With a road network in place, economic geography itself shifted to Rome's advantage and to the advantage of its subjects. Travel time shortened, and cities that sat at crossroads swelled into hubs where brokers, craftsmen, and tax collectors congregated. These hubs became the beating hearts of regional economies, where surplus could be gathered and redistributed across the empire. Merchants learned to optimize routes, to time shipments with seasons, and to use relay stations and inns that dotted the roads. The predictability of these routes encouraged investment in longer journeys, making luxury trade economically sensible alongside the everyday moving of food and fuel. If the roads were the arteries, the Mediterranean was the imperial bloodstream labeled Mare Nostrum, our sea. Rome treated the Mediterranean not as a barrier, but as a highway that connected its provinces with a speed land routes could not match. Maritime trade multiplied the scale of commerce and allowed bulk goods to flow toward centers of consumption. Like Rome itself, ports became magnets for economic activity, and maritime laws and imperial navies protected shipping in ways that encouraged long-distance trade. Control of the sea converted scattered coastal towns into nodes in a network that radiated wealth and power across the known world. Roman maritime technology focused on reliability and cargo capacity more than dramatic speed. Ships were built for hauling grain, olive oil, and ceramics across predictable voyages along well-known coastal routes. Sailors learned to read winds, currents, and shorelines, turning the Mediterranean into a calendar where trade depended on seasons and tides. Lighthouses, breakwaters, and harbor infrastructure increased safety and capacity, making crowded ports more efficient. This investment in maritime infrastructure showed that Rome understood the economics of risk and reward when it came to seaborne commerce. Maritime trade brought risk, and Romans built institutions and practices to manage it just as they built roads to reduce travel time. Convoys and naval escorts sometimes accompanied merchant fleets when piracy threatened the lanes, and merchants formed partnerships to share the burden of loss. Contracts were written, witnesses recorded transactions, and penalties enforced responsibility across long distances. Insurance, like practices and legal recourse, turned dangerous voyages into calculable investments, which encouraged even wealthier investors to finance maritime voyages. The existence of these systems allowed capital to flow into higher-risk enterprises while keeping the engine of trade humming. The lifeblood of Rome's food security was grain, and Egypt served as the empire's breadbasket in a relationship both strategic and economic. Grain shipments moved in scheduled cycles, filling Roman granaries and stabilizing urban food supplies in ways that legitimized state power. The annona, Rome's grain dole, made the emperor intimately involved in commerce and the logistics of feeding millions. Because grain trade required scale, it created port infrastructure, specialized shipping, and storage techniques that improved the handling of all goods. The centralization of grain flows demonstrated how trade could underpin political stability and civic order within the empire. Wine and olive oil were the liquids of empire, traded in amphorae and transmitted through taste as well as commerce. These staples traveled from Iberia, Gaul, and North Africa into the kitchens and rituals of cities across the empire. Amphorae, stamped and standardized, became one of the earliest forms of packaging that allowed mass trade to be auditable and transportable. The trade in these commodities fostered specialized production regions, merchant networks, and branding by workshops and estates. The ubiquity of Mediterranean agricultural products not only shaped diets, but also integrated economies through mutual dependency on produce and distribution networks. Beyond staples, luxury goods revealed a hunger for exotic status that drove long-distance trade networks farther than Rome could directly control. Silks, spices, pearls, and jade crossed continents through a chain of middlemen, each increasing the price and mystique of the object. The appetite for these items created incentives to explore maritime and overland routes, extending Rome's commercial reach into Asia and Africa. Luxury consumption mattered, because it translated distant lands into currency, symbols, and social distinctions within Roman society. Elite demand for foreign goods connected Rome to a chain of production and exchange that spanned thousands of miles. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a braided network of land and sea routes that linked Rome with India and China. Goods moved in stages, passing through hands, languages, and cultures before adding themselves to a Roman market. The overland route often met maritime routes at ports and oases, creating hybrid trade paths that adapted to monsoons, deserts, and political borders. Roman demand for silk, spices, and gemstones turned distant producers into integral parts of an economic web that reached beyond imperial boundaries. The Silk Road demonstrates that trade is as much about intermediaries and institutions as it is about origin and destination. Trade with India and China relied heavily on intermediaries who linked producers to Roman buyers through a series of transactions. Roman traders often never met the original craftspeople who made silks or spices, but they reaped the value through networks of agents, porters, and local brokers. The seasonal monsoon winds permitted predictable maritime voyages that made India a predictable trading partner by sea. Maritime trade with the East often bypassed some overland costs, enabling higher volumes and different goods to circulate. The resulting exchange was cultural as well as commercial, with religions, technologies, and styles riding the same routes as merchandise. Merchants were the actors who translated infrastructure into profit, and they took on varying social statuses across the empire. Some merchants were elite equites with capital to invest in fleets, while others were freedmen or small-time agents who specialized in particular goods. Their mobility and networks gave them practical knowledge and influence that often rivaled political power in local contexts. Merchant life involved risk, negotiation, and adaptive strategies that included partnerships, credit, and social alliances. The economy depended on these people because infrastructure itself was inert without the initiative, skill, and courage of individuals willing to move goods across uncertain terrain. Guilds and collegia created a semblance of corporate identity, long before modern companies existed, binding skilled tradespeople and sailors into collective organizations. These groups provided mutual aid, regulated standards, and sometimes lobbied local authorities to protect their interests. Shipping associations known as naviculari pooled capital to finance fleets, distributing risks and returns among many investors. Through collegia, craftsmen and merchants created reputational systems that made third-party enforcement feasible across distances. These social institutions turned dispersed economic actors into coordinated networks capable of sustaining long-distance commerce. Coinage was the glue that held this sprawling system together, because money converts diverse goods into a common language. The denarius and aureus became recognizable standards that eased exchange across provincial economies with different local tokens. Roman coins circulated in marketplaces, temples, and tax offices, and their images reinforced political messages alongside economic value. Standardized currency reduced transaction costs and encouraged price transparency, enabling merchants to compare offers across regions. When coins bear an emperor's face, economic integration becomes inseparable from political authority and the symbolism of unity. Banking and credit systems grew to meet the needs of an empire engaged in constant exchange and investment. Argentari or Roman bankers provided loans, exchanged currency, and managed deposits, facilitating transactions in distant markets. Letters of credit and promissory notes allowed merchants to move value across space without transporting bulky coinage. These financial innovations increased the velocity of money and allowed more complex transactions to be carried out with less risk. by providing mechanisms for credit and settlement. Roman finance magnified the scale and scope of commerce throughout the empire. Economic integration reshaped provincial life by encouraging urban growth and specialization around trade hubs. Towns with good access to roads and ports attracted artisans, exporters, and tax offices, evolving into city centers with market economies. Agricultural regions specialized in certain crops or products based on comparative advantages supported by transportation and market access. This specialization increased productivity and wealth in some regions while creating dependencies and vulnerabilities in others. The empire's coherence, therefore, hinged on economic interdependence that required continued investment in infrastructure and political stability. Trade was also a carrier of culture, ideas, and identity across the empire, and exchange often meant transformation. Foods, fashions, religious practices, and technologies moved along the same networks that carried goods and profit. A provincial villa might adopt imported pottery, a new religious cult, or architectural styles because trade made them visible and desirable. In this sense, commerce became an invisible architect of cultural change, knitting diverse peoples into a shared repertoire of tastes and practices. The Roman world became more cosmopolitan because trade brought the foreign into everyday life, normalizing novelty through repetition and availability. Politically, trade helped legitimize Roman rule by creating stakeholders who benefited from imperial stability and infrastructure. Local elites profited from tax revenue and commercial activity, and therefore had incentives to maintain loyalty to Rome. The movement of goods reinforced administrative reach, making distant provinces feel economically and procedurally connected to the center. This economic alignment was not automatic, and it required constant negotiation, patronage, and sometimes coercion. Nevertheless, the prosperity generated by trade under the Pax Romana provided a persuasive argument for the costs of imperial membership. Yet this commercial machine was not eternal, and by examining its strains we learn something important about economic fragility. As piracy rose, borders shifted, and administrative capacity weakened, trade routes became less reliable and more expensive. Disruptions in grain shipments, coin shortages, and local unrest magnified each other into systemic instability that challenged the cohesion the empire relied upon. The decline shows that infrastructure needs continuous guardianship and adaptation, and that trade networks are vulnerable to political fragmentation. These lessons resonate today in ways that are both practical and philosophical for modern economies. The legacy of Roman trade is visible in modern infrastructure, law, and economic thought that still reference Roman innovations. Roads evolved into modern highways, maritime law traces its ancestry to ancient practices, and the idea of currency-backed integration predates modern nation-states. Even the vocabulary of commerce retains echoes of Roman institutions and instruments. Roman trade taught future societies that connectivity and rules forge markets, and that markets in turn shape politics and culture. The empire was not simply a relic of conquest, but a prototype for the relationships between infrastructure, money, and power that define globalization. Thinking about Roman trade forces us to reconsider what unity means in an empire or nation. Unity in Rome was not only achieved through force and law, but through the daily logistics of moving food, goods, and money. The act of exchange created convergent interests across diverse peoples who found value in being part of a larger connected market. This economic perspective complicates simple narratives of domination and resistance, because it shows that many people voluntarily participated in imperial systems when they saw clear benefits. Trade was therefore both coercive and consensual, a paradox that modern states still navigate when balancing integration with local autonomy. When we look at the ancient maps and dusty ledgers, we are reminded that infrastructure and institutions create possibilities that outlive their builders. The Romans built roads to move legions, but those roads moved ideas, foods, and fashions that reshaped societies. Pax Romana was a political project that produced an economic reality where exchange became a method of governance. The philosophical twist is that peace and the rule of law can be instruments of freedom and instruments of control at the same time. Trade under Rome gave people choices, but it also knitted them into dependencies that made leaving the imperial system costly and complex. In our own world, networks of trade and finance create similar paradoxes of empowerment and entanglement. Modern globalization borrows from Roman lessons about infrastructure, monetary integration, and the cultural power of exchange. We see how roads, ports, And predictable laws reduce risk and broaden possibilities, just as they did 2,000 years ago. Understanding Roman trade gives us perspective on contemporary debates about borders, supply chains, and economic dependency. The past offers tools for thinking about the present, if we are willing to map ancient patterns onto modern dilemmas responsibly. So, what does this mean for how we build and govern networks today, whether physical or digital? It suggests that infrastructure is never neutral and that the institutions surrounding it determine who benefits and who pays. Investments in roads, ports, and legal frameworks shape political alignments, social mobility, and cultural exchange across generations. If Rome teaches anything, it is that material connectivity creates moral and political obligations that outlive the projects themselves. Trade builds worlds, and the question becomes what kind of world we intend to build with the networks we create today. History remembers emperors and generals, but economies remember the quiet, repetitive acts that make exchange possible. The packing of amphorae, the carving of milestones, and the signing of contracts were the small rituals of empire that accumulated into something vast. These mundane acts were the real engine of Roman cohesion and their legacy in the modern world. So when you trace a highway or open an imported packet at your table, remember that those routines have ancient antecedents rooted in projects like the Pax Romana. The everyday mechanics of trade connect you to a long lineage of people making sense of scarcity through cooperation and infrastructure. There is a final irony in the Roman story. The very peace that enabled prosperity also made the empire dependent on far-flung supply lines. Prosperity bred complexity, and complexity bred vulnerability to shocks and mismanagement. The lesson is ancient and contemporary at once. Prosperity without resilience can become fragility in the face of change. That irony should not discourage investment in connectivity, but rather inform how we design systems today. Building durable, equitable, and adaptable networks requires learning from Rome about scale, institutions, and the politics that govern exchange. If this exploration of Roman trade has given you a new perspective, then you have joined the ancient conversation between merchants, magistrates, and citizens across time. The Pax Romana stands as an experiment in how rule, infrastructure, and markets create unity and division at once. Our task is to take its lessons seriously while building more resilient and fair networks for the present. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and share this with someone who loves history, economics, or the invisible systems that shape our lives. Thank you for watching, and keep asking how the roads of the past still guide the routes of our future.